Kingdom One family, welcome back to another podcast. Here at Kingdom One, we offer HR, finance, coaching, education, and strategy that gives your ministry peace of mind so that you can focus on the ministry that you love. Schedule a call today by visiting kingdomone.co/get-started. Someone will be contacting you as soon as possible. Avoid the frustration of high turnover, poor staff culture, and lost time and dollars by partnering with a trusted and experienced ministry partner. Our client ministries no longer struggle with stalled initiatives. And if that's something that you struggle with, we can help. You can go to kingdomone.co/get-started to get a plan of action that catapults your ministry into health. Visit kingdomone.co/get-started today. On today's podcast, we're chatting with Stephen Bush and Kendra Holaby. We are launching a brand new podcast. It is called Two in a Box. This is about our leadership structure. You're going to want to take some notes on this one.
Welcome to the Kingdom One podcast, where we grow the church together. This podcast is here to give you big ideas and help you get practical with the tactical. Here's your host.
Hey guys, welcome to another Kingdom One podcast. So glad you're here. We have a brand new podcast for you. This is called Two in a Box with Stephen Bush, our CVO, and Kendra Holaby, our COO. And so as I'm joined with our COO and CVO, today we're talking about leadership, specifically leadership structures. And the title of this podcast is Two in a Box, which is kind of like our leadership structure. But before we get into that, Stephen, can you kind of let us know a bit about your background?
Sure. Yeah. A lot of my sort of background prior to coming into vocational ministry in the marketplace was as an HR practitioner. And so I worked in several different industries, worked in retail, human services, high-tech entertainment, software. My last company was a multinational company. I worked with the C-suite, supporting chief legal officer, the chief talent and strategy officer as an HR professional. And then one day, got the call from my local home church. The executive pastor called me and said, "Stephen, will you come and be the business administrator of our church?" And so got to step into that role, did that for 6 years. And during that time frame is where really felt the calling of the Lord to begin this parachurch ministry called Kingdom One, which is really, as Nick said, to bring this expertise, this competence, but even more so, this transformational relationship to your church, to your school, your camp, your faith-based nonprofit, and to be able to give you access to really the folks on our team to step into your context and help you in your season of ministry. And so that's a little bit about me and kind of the work that I've done both in the marketplace and in the ministry world.
That's rad. Kendra, what about you? What's your background?
Yeah, so I've been in HR for about 19 years now, been in ministry just as long. So I married a former youth pastor and started ministry that way. But my HR career started in marketplace, was in healthcare. I've been in restaurant. I had been in hospitality for a lot of years. And then I joined ministry for about 5 years, where I had been with a local mega church, really helping them grow from like 2 campuses to 9 in that season. So I've had a wide range, everything from running a front desk early in my career to doing really strategic HR work now. And so what I love to be able to do is help our ministries with both taking marketplace experience and then my church world experience and kind of merging those together so they get the best of both worlds is what the hope is and what we do.
That's rad. That's really cool. So I guess a couple of questions as we kick off today is, can you explain the current mainstream model of leadership in business and ministries? Because I think what we are talking about today might buck a little bit of that model.
Yeah, I think, in the business world, it's a really wide spectrum, right? And so it's really kind of driven by the industry that you're in, sort of the scope and scale of the business. I think there's a lot of celebrity CEOs that we see in the news all the time. And so often these CEOs are surrounded then by kind of their own celebrity C-suite, right? And so you have kind of your CFO, your CHRO, your CTO, your COO, that all really represent kind of the major functions within your business. And so, again, I think depending upon sort of what your favorite company is or who's in the news, mostly you see, again, these really prolific kind of just celebrity status people that we look to and say, what are they doing? Have they written a book about leadership? Those different types of things. And then we're kind of digesting maybe perhaps some cues, if you will, in terms of how we respond to them. And then I think in the ministry side, I think, what we see a lot, I'll just kind of maybe hone in, especially on churches, perhaps. But churches, they tend to be led by a senior pastor. And if they're large enough, they're supported by generally an executive pastor is what we see. And so we also tend to see the senior pastor generally is like the primary communicator, the primary teacher of the church, while that executive pastor, that second chair tends to be more so kind of in the background and tasked with really leading the staff and more of like the day-to-day operations of the church. And so but a lot of times too, those senior pastors can kind of be really put on a pedestal in a lot of ways, even in the ministry world, where you have, just like in the business world, folks that are very visible, sought out, have they written a book, those types of things. And so again, this is where we see maybe the ministry world sometimes emulating a little bit of what the business world looks like in terms of its leadership model and structure, if you will, sort of at the top.
Yeah. There's just celebrity, when you think about Disney, there's Bob Iger who's stepping back. You think about Elon Musk and Twitter and Tesla. And these people, they do have a bit of celebrity, and it's almost like whatever they say or whatever they tweet, people gravitate towards that. And so does the pastor as CEO model serve the church well, or does it hurt the church well? And I would also want to know, why do you think that, specifically through the lens of, everybody's hanging on pastor's very word?
I think, at least from my perspective, I think what matters the most at the top leader of any organization, whether it's ministry or marketplace, really is that they have good, solid leadership skills at the end of the day. I think it super distracts from the mission of a church when the senior top leader is really just trying to, influence in social media, or they're just trying to become a celebrity, or they might be just a really gifted communicator, and that's okay too. We really need churches to be gifted, and pastors to be good gifted communicators. But sometimes the most gifted communicators in an organization don't always make the best leaders sometimes. And so it's so maybe true. Kind of leading our from our strengths in that way would be super important. So I think sometimes it's we tend to say the most gifted communicator should be the top leader, but that's not also always the case, because they lack maybe the just genuine strength of general leadership. And so that ends up trickling down the organization in really unhealthy ways when we put that gifted communicator as like the top leader, if that makes sense.
A bit on that, because I think when we see leadership in the church, we think of a strong communicator, somebody who is prolific, somebody who can, command a crowd. But can we maybe talk about what are some of those other things that are necessary in leadership that might not be in communication, but are still very valuable, that a great communicator may or may not lack, but is definitely needed for leadership? What would you say that would be?
They need 100% authentic truth tellers surrounding them. Like accountability that is maybe even brutal, but in a really truthful, graceful way still. I think what ends up happening is people in that spot end up surrounding themselves with people who just kind of agree with them. And they really do need people who are challenging their thought process, challenging the way they lead, challenging what they see happening in their spiritual life. Because too many times we see that doesn't happen. And then they're in a silo because they are not having people tell them the truth around them. And so I think accountability, number one, amongst other pastors who serve in similar spots is good also. But just, they need to surround themselves with people who can see them for who they are, but then also tell them the truth no matter what.
I think I totally agree with you in that, Kendra. And I think even back to kind of the concept of the senior pastor having to be the primary communicator, we've worked with a lot of really great senior pastors that are also really great communicators. But I think what makes them actually a great senior pastor is not necessarily just their communication. I think it is that they have truly the spiritual gift of leadership, and leadership meaning, how am I in this role really receiving from God what the vision is for our organization, for our church, or I'll even inject Christian school or camp or whatnot. How then am I articulating that to our staff through our mission, through our values, and then how am I living a life as a leader that reflects those values, that is galvanizing our staff towards that. And even if I have an executive pastor or a COO, like how am I even then sharing in some of that leadership, which we'll talk about? That's kind of the 2 in the box model. But I think at the end of the day, Nick, honestly, and I don't mean this as a slight at all to sort of how the church in America seems to have structured itself, where it's great if you're an incredible communicator, but I think the gift of teaching, the gift of really that stage presence doesn't necessarily mean that you're naturally inherently gifted in leadership. And I think the truly great ministries are those that do have really great leaders at the helm. But I think sometimes we put too much pressure on a senior pastor to have to be a gifted communicator. And we're actually seeing a growing trend of where maybe the proverbial XP is more the communicator, if you will, or there's a teaching team. And the senior pastor truly is gifted in leadership, maybe not the best from the stage, but 100% making sure that everything from the stage to what happens, all throughout the week, all throughout the year, and, through the trajectory of that ministry's growth and sort of service to its community is flowing well and is being led well, not just that the stage is being covered well in terms of good communication.
That's great. That's great. I love to hear that because it kind of reminds me of the fivefold ministry, like that it's not just one person. It's a group of individuals who are called to shepherd the church. So as we talk about that, how is the 2 in the box model different? Like how is it just different from what we're seeing currently in churches?
Well, I do want to share one other real quick thing too, is that I really appreciate, I'll kind of pick on the business world for a little bit. So the conventional CEO, if you will, I think there's some really great movement towards what is a CEO. And Simon Sinek actually talks about this a little bit, where he says, I really think even the title, but not so much just the title because it's just the nomenclature, but the idea of a CEO needs to transform. And really, it should be less of an emphasis on just I'm the top dog, and it really is more about becoming the chief visionary officer. And so, in fact, even my role here at Kingdom One, I started as the CEO of Kingdom One and became the CVO, which a lot of ministries, when we interact with them, they're like, what's a CVO? I'm so glad you asked. But really, my job is to steward the vision of our organization. And I think that as we get into 2 in the box, it's so important that there is truly a chief vision officer, somebody who's saying, here's the vision, here's what I think God is calling us to do. And as Kendra said, like, I'm going to have truth tellers around me, not sort of many visioneers, if you will. And a lot of times, again, we'll see ministries that have a top dog who maybe, again, is sort of that chief communicator. And they'll look to their staff and just be like, what should we do this year? And I don't think that's the right question to be asking. Or they'll put it to their executive pastor. Hey, I'm going to go write a book, or I'm going to go kind of disappear into a sermon series. Like you kind of set what we're going to be doing this year as a church. Man, I think that's such a reversal of what a healthy 2 in the box, or even just a healthy leadership style would look like. And so even in the marketplace, I would say the challenge is how do we really embrace this idea of a CVO? And honestly, why not let the ministry space be where this is best sort of practiced and then exported into the business world as a great model. So as we dive into 2 in the box, I think that's another important distinction, is how do we actually lose sort of the CEO idea and reimagine that as a CVO, and then how that really functions then perhaps with your XP or your COO.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that you bring to light there when you talk about, maybe the lead communicator doesn't have the vision, leaves the vision to the staff or the executive team. But then if there were to come, like, say, discrepancy, and like maybe we don't go there, and then maybe all this work has been put into it, and then there's just this constant cultural shifting of like, we're following this person's vision, and now we're following our lead pastor's vision. It almost feels sometimes that there could be a tug of war there.
Yeah, and I think the important distinction is the CVO, the senior pastor, the school administrator, like they should own the vision, where everybody else plays a huge role is the strategy. And there's a huge difference between vision and strategy. I think strategy says, I hear the vision, I hear what we're trying to accomplish, and I can see how that even spans multiple years in terms of what this vision, this purpose of our organization is intended to do. I have the values that tell me how I'm supposed to behave in response to that vision in terms of how I conduct my actions. Now I'm going to put together strategies that are going to help us accomplish that vision. But I'll just be really honest. I see a lot of ministries where, again, there's sort of this vacuum of vision. And so department heads or different sort of leaders within a ministry, meaning very well, start constructing their own vision. But let me just tell you, your budget can't afford all of these sort of mini visions. Your congregation can't volunteer at all of these mini visions. That's where, again, this chief vision officer plays this really important leadership role to drive that vision, to own it and steward it well, and then invite and activate and galvanize the COO, the XP, the staff, congregation, and ultimately the community. And how do we realize that through the strategy? And so again, don't give away your role, your God-given sort of placement in terms of owning and stewarding that vision. And that's why that's such an important distinction in even kind of the titling of that sort of leadership position, if you will.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I'm really excited to dive into this. How is the two in the box model different? I just so curious on what your thoughts are about this.
There's actually a couple different models out there. Most people probably interact with a 1-2 model where it's just, very hierarchical. So if you think about the two in a box, the two in a box phrase really comes from, if you look at an org chart, everyone has a little box, right? But you really start to put two people in a box. It's really a co-leadership type model. And there's many motivations for why you might do a different type of leadership model in your organization, but it really bases off that top leader. And it's really based around what they need as being in that top leader. So it needs flexibility, and that's why there's not a lot of books out there if you read about the two top spots. If you go to Amazon, you probably will find maybe a handful of leadership books that even talk about what it means to have a top leader and then their second, number two relationship overall, because it's such a unique space. So the hierarchy doesn't change. It's not like all of a sudden we're equals in the org chart. The org chart boxes stay right where they're at, but how we decide to lead is based on complementing then that senior leader in that spot. So we've seen some pretty successful tuna boxes. Like if you look back at Disney, back Eisner and Katzenberg, they were co-leaders. They really were, even though they were two separate boxes in the org chart, they really had a really great partnership. So they were actually really able to co-lead Disney really well in that season. It works best when the skill sets are actually a little bit different so that you can complement each other and more complete each other rather than trying to compete with each other in terms of skill sets, or too much of vision, right? Like we mentioned, is actually not good in that spot. One of the things we did pretty early on was actually work through then in that model, what things are different about our roles, how we will operate differently, and then also what things we shared. So we did a Venn diagram. So if you guys are big Venn diagram fans, you can create a Venn diagram to really put what is it that you own? What is it that he owns? How are some of these things then shared, and where do we share these things? So that way there's a clear line of delineation and responsibilities, and we're not confused about, well, I thought I was doing that or you're doing that. That doesn't really happen. So the two in the box is different because a lot of leadership models are very just hierarchical. I give orders, they go down the chain in the org chart, and I just drive that all the way down, which again can still work just depending on who your number two is and who that top leader is in that spot. We've just chosen two in the box because we feel it best suits our different skill sets.
And I think, again, what really makes that work well, even kind of back to the Venn diagram, is I would even encourage you, if you're listening to this, you're an executive pastor, you're a senior pastor, or a camp administrator, whatever sort of leadership role you find yourself in, is even just that Venn diagram. What I appreciate about it is that we were very intentional. We said, man, how can I understand the lane, so to speak, where I am just really meant to own sort of fully? What are the shared responsibilities that we want to really make sure we're both participating in well? And then what are the areas I want to make sure I'm not smothering you, I'm not getting engaged? Because again, the whole point of this is that we're complementing each other. We are not just dividing and conquering, but we are synergistically handling the mantle of leadership, particularly here at Kingdom One. But beyond just the conversation and then putting it to paper was really then sharing that with our staff to say, here's what you can expect from us. Here's how we are approaching this leadership model. I would encourage you, I don't know how many ministries actually articulate what even the dynamics between an SP and an XPR, beyond the SP gets to do what they maybe want to do, and the XP just needs to kind of figure out how to pull that off. I don't think that's healthy. I think even I've sat in sometimes in meetings where it's just all of a sudden we're going a totally different direction because the senior pastor, maybe in that case, just decided something. And it's well, man, with better articulation, with better construction and engineering of even something as simple as a Venn diagram to say what are our respective lanes. I think the staff becomes so appreciative of the culture that flows out from that two in the box. And there's less like really sharp turbulence, if you will, from the top. Staff are like, man, I don't know what just happened, but I guess something just happened. So now we're doing something else. And so again, how do we construct something that allows our staff to experience in our congregation or our church or our camp, whatever sort of your context, to appreciate the dynamics of that relationship and not dread it?
Yeah, I've heard that sometimes that's called like the Pelican leadership model, where like an SP will like fly off, and when they come back and then they land, and then there's just poop everywhere, and then they fly off again, and it's up to the staff to kind of clean it up. And I don't mean that in a crass way, but I do like that's what sometimes that turbulence can feel like to a staff member. I also think that there are really considerations that senior pastors and executive pastors have that that staff people don't see. And what I really appreciate about the model that we currently are sitting in is that it doesn't feel like there's a lot of turbulence. If anything changes, if there's a pivot, if there's any, thing that we have to deploy, sudden movement, it's not because it wasn't unaware, it's because it's time to sprint. And I think there's a difference between knowing when there's a time to sprint and then just turbulence for turbulence sake, because decisions weren't thought all the way through. And so when we talk about this model, what are some of advantages to this model?
The primary one really is, and the primary advantage of a two-in-a-box model is that so long as we can get along well, then it creates a strong partnership at the top instead of it being hierarchical, in a sense, which is, again, very just typical. We strongly believe when we talk about a lot at Kingdom One, which is that we're just better together overall. And so if we can then, infuse that also and realize that the top leader also needs a partner, not in a, equal way, but more just still someone that we can work together with, then we are better together overall. And so I think we create some silos when we have a typical leadership model. We don't create accountability. We kind of make decisions in silos, which can be hard. We don't want to make decisions in a vacuum. So it's really important that we can invite each other into different spaces when we're talking about making decisions or just leadership overall. I think also what's nice about this kind of model is that we can depend on one another. So it's not like, oh, I'm just over here doing things and I'll tell you about it at the end of the day. Like there's a real sense that we can collaborate and talk about things and work through that. And so it fends off, I think, some loneliness also in leadership, which again happens at the top a lot, is that senior leaders or even COOs or XPs are all feeling like I'm the only one doing this thing inside the organization. And so if there's a strong partnership there as well, there's also fending off of a loneliness there that can happen really all the time inside a ministry construct, because we do keep very tight silos around our different roles.
Two heads ultimately really are better than one. And so I think even if you are a visionary and you are really great at articulating vision, it's just hard to maintain a great perspective at all times of how your organization is doing, the temperament of your staff, how even all the way down the execution of the things are unfolding. And so this allows for really a strong partnership that is also great to uncover and mitigate blind spots, to support one another, to be able to, again, hopefully not even create sort of this celebrity or this like, oh, it's all kind of on this iconic person to tell us what to do and how to do it. And depending upon your model, again, I like your Pelican model because I think that's so true. Like, please don't go on vacation, or please don't go to that conference, or please don't read that book, because we don't know what the next month holds for us, because it's just going to be, kind of this wild ride. But I think, again, it allows for a better overall leadership culture that flows into the greater culture of your organization and allows, again, your staff, your congregation, or your constituency that you're serving, hopefully to thrive as a result of that model.
I hear us talking a lot about hierarchy, and one thing that I think like is an advantage to this model is I feel like we all get along very, very well because we submit one to another, like biblically based, theology would ask us to, instead of it being just, we just submit. It's actually like it's a lot of give and take here, and so I highly appreciate that, because I don't know if there's been an organization where I'm like, here's my feedback. And what happens with my feedback is it gets tested, and that's really nice to kind of have better quality feedback when we all can speak to that. And so I really appreciate how you guys kind of set the tone for that in the rest of the organization. It's definitely felt. But even though this is a great model, can we talk about what some of the disadvantages to this model could potentially be?
Sure. I mean, it would be much simpler to stick to a typical, I think, leadership model, which is just a 1-2 model. You just the CEO or CVO or senior pastor just kind of drives direction down to the organization. XP follows and executes, and it's all fine, and that works in a lot of ministries. Again, just depending on the skill set of that top leader. I'm not negating the fact that a 1-2 model actually works really well still. So hear me in that. I think we've chosen this because I think it works. It plays to our strengths better, but it's a much more complex model. There's a lot more transparency that has to happen in this kind of model. There's a ton more trust that has to happen in this model. There's a ton of relationship building that has to happen in this model. We can't have an absent relationship and a co-leadership model actually work. So if it lacks relationship, or you don't have the emotional intelligence even to navigate the complexities of this kind of model, it's probably not a great model to adopt. But there are some disadvantages in the sense that it's just much more complex to navigate overall in an organization, because it could get like well, mom said, dad said, these kinds of things, or parent shopping even happens inside organizations. And so just being clear about that, like that can still happen in this kind of model if you're not careful. So transparency, trust, there's nothing that he says and out back and vice versa. Right. Yeah. Or if we're unsure, we say, I don't know, we're going to go talk about it and we'll come back with an answer. So I hate to really relate it to parenthood, but it really is some of that too. It's like we argue behind closed doors. If there's a disagreement, we're not going to argue in front of the kids. We're going to figure it out, come with a united front in the same way. We don't argue a lot, just for the record, but just making sure that some of those things are still unified for the staff. So again, they're not being pivoted one direction and pivoted a different direction. Everybody's like, I don't know what's happening with these two, but they're not on the same page. There just has to be a lot more alignment in how we move forward in that. And if we're unsure, we just pause before we take a step forward in a direction so that we can unitedly move forward the organization.
I think, even back to your comment, we don't argue a whole lot. I think that all stems from, and this is a disadvantage, is that if you are a leader that you don't feel like you can articulate a vision, then you're going to argue a lot, because really now it's just all tactics. It is like, what are we doing? When are we doing it? Well, I don't like that. I want to do this. There's nothing that's overarching telling us like this is where we should be going. So, you kind of end up arguing a lot more so because you live in the land of just like execution and doing, rather than really the why stage of what you're supposed to be doing. So again, I feel like that's worked well for us. So again, it doesn't work super well if you don't have a vision, if there's not something coming from that CVO, if you will, senior pastor, again, that senior leader that is owning the vision. This doesn't work well. Also, I would say similarly, if you're a leader, you're a senior leader, you love just being able to kind of bark orders and you're just surrounded. I think there's a model, it's kind of the early Apple model, where it's like the genius surrounded by 1,000 helpers, model, where I'm just a genius. I just need people to do the work for me. This is not a good model for that, because it's actually the antithesis of that. It is just, I want to push down kind of orders. And I've got kind of a chief person, that XP that's just going to carry out all the things that I wanted them to do. And so wouldn't work super well in that model. It also doesn't work well, and I hope I don't sound unkind, so please know our goal here is to encourage you, not to discourage you. But I will just say boldly that I have seen in some ministries, frankly, just an absent senior leader. They view teaching as their primary function. And oftentimes then they expand that teaching into, well, I'm going to go write a book and I'm going to go on a teaching circuit, and I'm basically going to be absent from my flock. Remember, you're the shepherd of your flock, so to speak. Shepherding speaks of proximity. It speaks of focus. And listen, if you are wanting to have a COO or an XP or whatnot, purely from the sense of that you get to disconnect from your ministry, that will not work in a 2-in-the-box model. You can't be an absent leader. You can't have an XP just to kind of keep the church or the ministry that you're running, so that way you can go and kind of have sort of a subsequent ministry. And so, again, I share that if you are looking for sort of that kind of construct, the 2-in-the-box will not work, because you do have to spend a really great fair amount of time invested in what's going on, conscious of how things are being carried out in the ministry, not micromanaging them by any means, but definitely participating, especially with your COO, your XP, and like, understanding how that's unfolding, how you can participate, how you can celebrate, how you can cheer people on, and even roll up your sleeves and participate, directly in some of the things that are taking place, while then coming back and casting vision again, and reminding really the organization of its purpose and its values, developing people, and participating in that. So that's where a two in the box would not be to your benefit if you prefer kind of those other constructs in your ministry.
I heard you say something about being in proximity, like spending lots of time together. And one of the things that like kind of comes to my mind is maybe there's a pastor who's listening to this, or a ministry leader, and they lead the ministry, but they kind of just have like their XP check in on their ideas. Is that kind of like the model, or are we talking about something completely different here? Because I could totally see a pastor being like, I have an XP and he checks all my thought processes. And so is that the same thing as a two in the box is my question.
I think, well, first I'll say, I think being very intentional in how you structure your time together, I think is really important. And it's not even just about spending time. So, for example, if you have a weekly one-on-one, I think that's great. And I think that's a very kind of beginning stage of that. But I think even saying, what are our rhythms, right? So even our one-on-ones, do we have a rhythm, throughout the month? Is our first one of the month centered on our people? Is the second one centered on kind of the initiatives that we have? Again, however you want to kind of engineer that. But I think if you're listening to this and you're like, man, we don't even do one-on-ones, really it's just like ad hoc, like we just meet when we sort of have to or need to. I will just tell you right now, I think you need to reprioritize your time, because that relationship is really important. What I would then say, if you want to kind of go for a silver level, Nick, maybe that's a bronze, is at least you're having, kind of a one-on-one. I don't know why we went Olympics, but, here we are. I think a silver then is really saying, like, how do we even carve out a deeper amount of time beyond maybe an hour every week, to have even a day, a month, that we are sitting down and we're really taking pause. And I think not all of it is just about how do we transact on all the things. I think it is like, how do we reflect? How do we spend time even thinking through what has transpired in the last month? And is that in keeping with the vision? Is that in keeping with where we're trying to go? And then I would say gold really is layer in rhythms that really feature what we would even call a mission slate here at Kingdom One. It is the rhythms of the year. So in Q1, what are the things that we really want to use our monthly times with? And let's be focused on that. Q2, Q3, Q4. And in between, I would just even challenge you with this, and I'll even put this back in the bronze. Your families also need to participate in this too. And so this friendship should also really billow out into beyond just even kind of the work time, so to speak. I so loved, I got to see even a senior pastor retire, whom I love deeply. And to see their families gather, the XP's family, the senior pastor's family gather on the stage. And it was like a big celebration for all of them of like, man, we've been able to walk this journey together. That was just really powerful. And so even just thinking through how you incorporate, your families into that space. But definitely you have to carve out time. You have to be intentional about it. You have to pursue it. You have to fight for it. And again, Nick, kind of in your example, if it's just, I'm just kind of checking in and it's maybe a little ad hoc and it's kind of on my to-do list, that doesn't really sound to me like the depth of a relationship that it takes to power a two in a box.
So when you guys schedule time, what do you call that scheduled time together? What is that called on the calendar?
We have a fun name. I mean, if we go back to like a couple of, if you guys remember a band, Dashboard Confessionals.
Oh yeah.
That was big back when I was younger. So we actually have a monthly rhythm right now where we call them whiteboard confessionals. So, I mean, I think every leader, I mean, you guys might resonate with this. Everybody, I feel like, loves whiteboards. And so it just is a way for all of us leaders to kind of like pour out whatever's in our brain. There's just something about a power of a whiteboard. So we started calling them whiteboard confessionals once a month. We also have like rhythms right now, and it may not be like this forever, but currently at the end of every day, we just kind of like debrief, or at the end of every week. We will even capture like what was a high and a low of a week. So that way we can kind of see, or what was a high and a low in a month, just so we can kind of capture like some wins as an organization and where we're tempering even our own emotions about what's happening in the organization. So those are the kind of the times where we can get really honest, more of the debrief. But the whiteboard confessionals are definitely more strategic, more high level. We're trying to figure out like where's the direction going, and so really important initiatives that are on our plate that we want to help lead our executive team through. So it allows us to get more intentional time, more in the business on the whiteboard confessionals. But the other like kind of meetings that happen, the rhythms are more just about how we're tempering our emotions in some of the initiatives and just really trying to take a really good stock of like what's working and what's good in a week. Because I think it's really easy as a leader to go like, man, there's all these things we want to do. We're just not getting to in that. And so I think this time allows us to go, let's actually examine in a lot of ways, a lot we do our spiritual life, the spiritual aspect of our organization, and just do a really good job of capturing what's good in the moment too. So I think we have a couple different rhythms, but the main one is the whiteboard confessionals, which is kind of fun.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was called Pinky in the Brain Time. That's
yeah.
Oh, well,
we do. Yeah, we have that.
We
too.
do have. It's like in parentheses it says Pinky in the Brain. It's like
It's a mashup,
if you remember Animaniacs, like Pinky in the Brain was also a really fun cartoon that we referenced that was just kind of like what are we working on today? It was kind of like okay, are we going to take over the world? It was kind of those sessions too.
That's rad. That's so fun. Cool. I have a couple of questions from staff. I think we probably have just enough time for maybe one or two from our staff. But one of our pastors on staff, Tim, he asks, what other voices does leadership involve when informing their decision for the church? I guess for us, it'd be what kind of other leadership, decisions are happening here at Kingdom One?
Yeah, I think it's such a great question. And it's interesting to kind of take in different church cultures or different, Christian school cultures or, whatever sort of your context may be. And so I think, again, a lot of this goes back truly to the clarity of roles and how a ministry functions. I think, again, that senior leader really should truly be owning the vision of that organization and infusing that into the mission slate. Hopefully, again, this is a practice that you're employing is like, what are we going after this year? How does that factor into maybe even a multi-year mission strategy that reflects our purpose? And so I think then really where a lot of voices come into play is the strategy around how to accomplish that mission or that vision, so to speak. It can get really tricky when you have other folks that are saying, that's a great vision, but I have a different vision. And so that's where there can be some real conflict. And I think, again, it's important to understand how to submit to authority, how to submit to leadership, while also that leader registering and receiving the voices that are saying, man, here's some ideas in terms of how we accomplish that from a strategic perspective. And then obviously, I think, back to kind of a local church context, you have your elders, you have your truth tellers that can also be, sources from your staff, but those elders, the board members, the trustees, whatever they're called, sort of in your ministry context, that are participating in accountability for that leader. I think, by the way, every senior pastor, every senior leader should be getting a performance evaluation. I know that might feel like a taboo thing to say in the ministry world, but we should be getting evaluated. At Kingdom One, I get evaluated by our board with input and voices from our staff to say, yes, like, are our values being upheld? Is our culture one that is healthy? Are we accomplishing our purpose? Are we fulfilling our goals in a way that's appropriate and healthy? And so I think in this, Nick, there's so many spaces to allow many voices within the context of sort of their roles in that ministry space that really then creates, hopefully, a beautiful harmony for that culture to be courageous, healthy, and effective, which is our purpose at Kingdom One, is to help ministries accomplish that sort of value, if you will.
I would just add to that too, just I've tried to always ask the question, like, are the right people in the room? I think to start, because I think sometimes we sequester executives in a room and we all make these decisions, and really the ones down below us are the ones that have to execute and all the things we're making decisions around. And so titles are less important around like who needs to be in the room. And I've seen shifts in leadership in ministries I've been in before where they were like, it just started as executives, and then it was kind of like, wait, there should be other people in the room, right? Like, and maybe they don't have an executive title, and that's okay. I think we just need to get the right people at the table to help you give the fullest picture possible, because we have lots of ambition in our roles, and we're like, we think our teams can do these things, not realizing that their efforts and energies might be, not where we think they are capacity-wise. And so we make decisions. We kind of burn out our team sometimes by trying to like make them execute at a level that's not healthy for them. But having the right people at the table really can help you say like, hey, that's actually not possible. We have 10 other things going on. And like, either we need to stop some things over here or, and make that a shift. But if we don't include those people at the table to have the conversation around all these other things we have going on, then I think we miss out an opportunity as leaders to really include them. So it's less about titles. It's more just about who can help us give us the fullest picture before we just like land the plane somewhere on some of these decisions. So I think that's important.
I think that's so great, Kendra, and I'll just say this too. I think that sometimes, and I'll just, maybe kind of direct this towards our friends that work in churches. I think there's even a sense that at the end of the day, the top table are all pastors. Love that. Love pastors. You guys are incredible. But I think even inviting in voices from the shared services space, if you will, I think is so important. And even if that pastoral office is not part of their calling or their function at the church, does not mean that their voice does not matter when it comes to some of those really important decisions, or even can be representative at sort of that top table, if you will, in terms of leadership. And so this is where, again, I think we have such an opportunity to be not so connected to a hierarchy, but really thinking more so through how do we accomplish this vision, who are the right people to have conversation and dialogue in terms of how we construct the strategy, and then ultimately achieve the results that we're hoping to in ministry, regardless of kind of what your ministry is doing. And so I appreciate you sharing that, because I do think sometimes, again, we get to be either so hierarchical or even in the church context. So, well, hey, you're not a pastor, so this isn't quite the right room for you to speak into. And so I think that's an important one for us to be cognizant of, but not necessarily give into. So, for Kendra and I in this 2 in the box model, this was our rookie year. 2022 was where we were learning how to do this, and I felt like we learned a lot through that. But we want to hear from you, because you experienced Kingdom One when it was a CEO-led organization with me, obviously being the CEO, and then now this past year you've seen the contrast. And so, kind of turning to you, Nick, as our illustrious host here, what do you feel like you experienced, kind of in the contrast between the two leadership models?
Definitely. I think what the contrast would have been when sitting under, directly under CEO, it almost felt like there was lots of space to execute. The space to think was like, it felt a little bit smaller. It felt like maybe strategy had to take a little bit of a back seat in order for us to facilitate a lot of quote unquote the work. I felt the moment that Kendra came in, she kind of maybe brought a little bit more of like, hey, we need to be strategic, and we also need to potentially slow down in key areas. And so it was the slowing down of key areas that allowed for some growth to happen within Marcom and some thinking to happen. And so based upon that, I really feel that, we, as under CEO, we were going fast and we were breaking things. Under 2 in the box model, it feels like we're still going fast, but there's definitely times to pause and to think about what is the strategy that's needed in order for this to be, long-term, that we don't, end up in burnout, and how can we even diversify some of the things that we do in order to serve the church a lot better. So that's been my experience so far.
Yeah, that's great.
Kingdom One family, thank you so much for tuning into another podcast. I enjoyed my conversation with Stephen and Kendra, and I love how intentional they are about creating culture from a leadership perspective. And this idea of 2 in a box is really important because it influences how the rest of culture operates. And you as a ministry leader, you have to understand the cornerstone of your legacy is the culture that you leave with your staff. And the reason for that is because your staff is the hands and feet that are touching and operating within your ministry. And if you feel that you have stalled initiatives, here at Kingdom One, we come alongside you and make sure that you have the tools, resources, and education that you need in order to make sure your staff culture thrives. If that sounds like something that you need today, go to kingdomone.co/get-started today so that somebody will be in touch with you within 48 hours to make sure that we can get you to courageous, effective, and healthy ministry. Thank you so much for tuning into this podcast. Until we chat again, let's grow the church together.